Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation is driven by one goal: housing affordability for all. They're about solving housing affordability together. CMHC offers supply-oriented programs, funding programs, market intelligence, research, data, and a team dedicated to push the boundaries of housing innovation. Visit cmhc.ca to learn more about how you can play a role in their ambitious goal that by 2030, everyone in Canada has a home that they can afford and meets their needs. CMHC helps make housing affordable in many ways. Learn more about Canada's National Housing Strategy, funding, research, and so much more at cmhc.ca.
We at On the Way Home would like to acknowledge the original stewards of whose lands this podcast is recorded on. In York Region, we recognize we're on the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples, and that this is the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And in Vancouver, we acknowledge that we are on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, whose presence on these lands continue to this day.
Welcome to On the Way Home, a podcast dedicated to the issues surrounding homelessness and the incredible experts making a difference in the lives of homeless people. Remember to subscribe to the podcast anywhere you're listening and share it with a friend.
Welcome to another episode of On the Way Home. I am your host, Michael Braithwaite from Blue Door. As always, we have an awesome guest to chat with today. And we're so fortunate that across the country, around the world, we have great people doing great work that are willing to actually come in and talk with us. Well, I say come in, virtually chat with us on the podcast. But before we get to that awesome guest, I want to tell you a little bit of what's happening at CAEH and Blue Door. As you know, we work together to bring this podcast to you. CAEH, Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, is always doing awesome stuff. And let me just kind of tell you a little bit of what's happening there. CAH, they're continuing to work alongside their vote housing partners to encourage immediate and meaningful action through the upcoming federal budget in order to address the housing and homeless crisis in Canada. And there's a massive crisis. If you don't know that, you have not been listening to this show. Shame on you. Right now, we're watching out for the upcoming budget announcement and pushing a major investment to go towards affordable housing. So stay tuned for that. Thank you to the folks at the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness for the work you're doing. At Blue Door right now, lots of stuff happening. Very exciting. We have a construction social enterprise called Construct that's been operating for about a year and a half now. And we just got news. We generally operate in York and Durham, and it looks like we might be sliding over a little further west. So if you think of, for those of you not familiar with the GTA, you have Toronto. On top of Toronto, you have York Region, and to your east, you have Durham, and to your west, you have Peel. It looks like Construct is going to be moving into Peel and working a little bit with Humber College there as well. So exciting times as that construction social enterprise continues to grow and help prevent homelessness. And I could talk about Construct all day, but I'm not going to, because that's not the purpose of this podcast. Let's get to today's guest, because she is awesome. Today, with me, I have Kaite Burkholder Harris. Yes, Kaite Burkholder Harris. And I think, you see a lot of like Michael J. Fox, a lot of Hollywood stars who go with the three names. Kaite is a star in our sector. So, of course, the three names. She is the executive director at the Alliance to End Homelessness Ottawa. Prior to this, she was working at a national level as a policy analyst with Reaching Home, the federal government's homelessness partnering strategy. And I'll tell you this too, just interrupt this bio for a second to say, the policy analysts are always who I go to for the right information, right? You might be talking to your minister and they always look over at the policy analysts to say, hey, tell me where to go here. So you might as well start there too. So she did important work there. Previously, she worked as a systems planner with the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, another good friend of the podcast. And really, if the best research across Canada, around the world, has been done by the Homeless Hub and the Observatory. And spent a number of years working as a project manager for A Way Home Ottawa in preventing and ending youth homelessness. And I'm familiar with her work there too. Having worked as a frontline mental health worker, Kaite has a strong understanding of some of the challenges that people living on the streets face. Motivated by a desire to see larger systems change, Kaite is energized by engaging and mobilizing new stakeholders towards the goal of safe and affordable housing for everyone in our community. And man, you're energizing me just with this bio. Kaite, welcome to the show.
Hi, Michael. Thanks so much for having me.
We ask a standard question, and there is no standard answer because it's very personal to everyone who comes on the show. It means something a little different. But let's find out what it means to you. What does home mean to you?
Yeah, I was thinking about this a lot because so often the answer is the people, right? Like home is about family, or it's about the people and community that you're with. And so I think of that, and it's the combo of community, and it's the combo of having a space that I can retreat to. And so much of what I think I'm able to do in the world and be engaged it happens because I actually have a home base to come back to, and know that when I make mistakes in the real world, I can come home and it's a space where there's no judgment, right? And you can just be yourself and let your guard down. I think that's something that's so valuable, and every person needs that and has a right to that.
Yeah, it's, as always, we get great answers around this. And if I hear you correctly, it is just that center. Keeps you centered. It's your center. It's a place to return back to, right? It's stability. So very, very cool. And it's all of that to so many people. So we're going to talk about the awesome work that you're doing with your team, of course. But let's start with defining. We wanted to talk a lot today about renovictions. We hear that term a lot. But let's talk about what, for people that may not know, what is a renoviction, and why is it such a focus for End Homelessness Ottawa?
Yeah, so a renoviction is basically, there's legal and illegal renovictions, but a renoviction is when your landlord says, hey, I need to renovate the building, so you may need to move out for a time period. And you do have some legal rights within that, but a lot of people, depending how long the renovation's going to be, they often say, I'm just going to move. Like, it's not worth kind of trying to find another place in the interim. And so that's something that we are hearing and seeing an increase in the last number of years. And I think the really important number I always keep in mind is across Canada, it's 15-1. We're losing 15 affordable units in the private market for every one purpose-built affordable unit. And that number is startling. And what I think is part of that phenomenon is very much to do with renovictions. So that's really where we want to talk about permanent solutions to the homelessness crisis. And we know that permanent solutions start with housing. Housing both nonprofit and also in the private sector. So for this piece, tenants' rights are so important, and how can we actually make sure we're protecting them better?
And that's a large part of what you do, right? Is that educational awareness piece? Because that 15-1 is so disturbing, because we hear the focus across the country, build more, 1,000 more units. That's great. And they're huge numbers. What you don't hear about are the numbers that we're losing daily that bite into all these new units, right? As you said, 15-1.
Yeah, and Toronto actually, I think, has a really good phrase for it. They call it fixing the leaky bucket. So it's like we can build and build and build and fill that bucket with all the water/housing units we want. But if we don't actually stop the hole, we're never going to be able to catch up. And so, in a private market where prices have gone up in Ontario by 26% just in the last year, that doesn't include the first year of COVID. Landlords are in a context where there's an incentive to sell the building. There's an incentive to renovate. People who used to be able to buy homes can't, so they now are renting and can pay higher rents. And so that's so much of what we're starting to hear anecdotally that's happening. And actually the Report Your Renoviction survey that we've put out as an agency is really trying to get more data on it and understand across Ontario, how common is this? We hear it from everyone, even up north. And yet we don't really have a ton of numbers, especially for the sort of gray area evictions. Renovictions are legal, but there's a lot where I think people are getting evicted under sort of false pretenses, oh, my family's moving in, and then somebody sees the unit on the market, 8 months later, which is illegal. And so things like that, and sometimes intimidation tactics, that's the kind of stuff we want to understand. It's like this gray legal area that will never get to the landlord-tenant board. So how do we actually find out more about that and bring that forward, especially to the federal housing advocate, to say, hey, people's rights are being violated. So what do we do to really make sure we're protecting tenants better?
Yeah, I remember having a conversation with someone involved with the Toronto community housing, and they were saying that so many, and they're it was Cynthia Summers, and she, I think, was the advocate for if you had tenant issues, they were kind of like a separate body you could go to. And she was saying you'd be surprised at how many people, not just with Toronto community housing in general, when they get a eviction notice, they go, okay. They just think, well, they're in charge, I have to leave. They don't fight it. Very few actually ask questions or fight it, right? Because they just assume they're in the wrong, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that's something that, if we have systems where the power is that the bigger system that has more power has all the information and the responsibility is on the little guy, quote unquote, or the person who's in a housing crisis to figure all of this out, go through the legal process. Like, that's an inequitable system. It's not going to work. And so how do we flip that and make sure that the bigger system is in charge of informing people of their rights? And I think we're increasingly in a space where I don't think it's fair to put that on landlords either. It needs to be municipalities. It needs to be provinces, to really make sure that it's not just about, we just need to provide more information by people seeking it out. But actually, in one case in Burnaby, they've actually made it so that the city has to provide the information as soon as a renoviction or an eviction notice is filed. And so that kind of stuff where the onus is on government. It's not on either the private landlord or on the person to figure it out. So that flip of the power, I think, is really important to try and get ahead on this issue.
Yeah, you're talking about systems change, absolutely. So we can talk kind of from organizational point of view. Here's what's happening, what's going on. Do you have any stories from Ottawa where you are about renovictions so people can kind of wrap their heads around something that's truly happened?
I mean, I think when I worked frontline, you heard about these stories all the time of people, and exactly what you say, people just leaving, right? They get so distressed, they get that notice, they don't know what legal rights they actually have, and so they leave. But those were often folks who are pretty low income, and I think what's been quite startling is in areas that are gentrifying, I've heard now from federal government workers in the Privy Council office, so like the head of government, saying, oh, this is happening in my building. And, I'm okay financially, but the woman who's on a pension beside me, a senior's pension, actually is going to be unable to stay in the building because of some of this happening. So that was a renoviction story where they wanted to have renovations and, the move would have just been too much. We've also heard stories of landlords not really sending an eviction notice, but saying things like, oh, I'm going to sell. So you should probably move out. You should really look at other places. Some places where, especially when people are working from home, we're going to enter, twice a day to investigate the renoviction or to investigate the reno that we want to do. And so when you start to have a landlord every single day and you're trying to do meetings and, be on Zoom, that's actually a threat to income as well. We've also heard stories of just overnight increasing amenities significantly. So all of a sudden your laundry costs 3 times as much, or your parking spot costs 3 times as much. And I think what's so startling to me is that this has really crept into people who are making good incomes, people who never would have saw themselves in this boat. Even when I've talked to reporters about it, I've now had 2 reporters say this is actually happening to me, which just kind of boggles the mind in terms of thinking about how far-reaching this really is. But I also think that means that there's some growing public awareness and hopefully some growing political will around the issue because people are starting to see how it's impacting them.
Well, I keep using the same survey over and over just because it blows my mind, right? So the Globe and Mail had a piece out a couple of weeks back that said, if we're looking at 30% of your household income that should be used towards, that's kind of the benchmark for housing, in the GTA, you'd have to make $90,000 a year. $90,000. I mean, come on. And if you look at OW, maybe like Ontario Works, you might have $8,000. ODSP, probably about $13,000. Like such a gap, right? And you're saying, I love what you're saying there too, is that people that were not feeling this before are starting to feel it. The renovictions I'll share with you. So I have a sister in Niagara, and she's been kind of in and out, precariously housed almost her entire life. The mental health and addiction challenges. And she, what happened to her about a year or so ago is the landlord came to her. And again, she just doesn't have the awareness education, didn't reach out, got her to sign something. And she said, he's such a nice guy. He's giving me $6,000 for me to leave. I said, not a nice guy. He's paying you off. Like he's, but it was too late. Like she signed the paperwork, she did that, and then was really upset about having to leave and saying, well, that's not fair. What can I do now? Didn't know her rights. Didn't, in Niagara, very tough to get in to see, to get legal help, pro bono legal help. And the other thing too is I think for a lot of people like my sister, very intimidated by landlords, by legal representation. Like the lawyer's not going to see me. I'm not worth. I can't. So it's what we're talking about. We need some total system change, right?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. It's a huge challenge, and I think ultimately, like that story is repeating itself so much, and like I think of even then in a context, what if I don't speak the language fluently? What if I, calling bureaucracy in general is a bit of a nightmare. I freak out when I call Rogers, like having to be on the phone and go through all of those things to try and get any access. And then when you look at what's happening with the landlord tenant board, and you're starting to hear stories more and more of people getting disconnected digitally because it's all gone digital, and literally getting evicted because their phone, messed up. And how many of us have been a Zoom meeting where nothing worked and our sound didn't work? And just when your housing is on the line, the severity of what's happening is so scary for folks. We just cannot continue to leave it up to the private sector to enforce a human right. Like they're not able to do it. It's on government. So how do we put the onus back for that systems change on government?
Well, you brought up something that it hadn't even crossed my mind when we talk about, people losing their homes, and of course, very, very tragic, and it upends their life. But there's so many people working from home now. Yeah. Another element of that, as you said, income security. If your income's tied to, you need a place to work from, and that's it, right? We never, I didn't have to really. We were talking about that 2 years ago, and that leads me to so. You think the pandemic has played a part in renovictions climbing?
Yeah, and this is the thing that I don't fully understand at this point, but I mean, we saw house prices drop almost immediately, I guess now 2 years ago, almost to the day when things started, the market crashed, everything was going on, and then this strange phenomenon of all of a sudden things started to escalate like mad. And housing regional spots where housing had always been affordable because people were moving because they were working from home. So you had a Toronto buyer move to, Halifax or to a smaller city on the East Coast. St. John, New Brunswick has seen massive increases in housing costs. And so it's like nowhere is like immune to this anymore. And I think that's what's so striking is people really can't find places to live that are affordable. And to your point about that 30% thing with the market, what's so weird to me is that we've now attached that to average market rent. And yet we know that average market rent is completely disconnected from reality. Like there is no relationship to reality in what an average market rent is because wages have stagnated. We know that. But when you increase market rent by 26 to 50% in like a 2-year period, how on earth is somebody able to afford that, right? Like it's just, everyone knows it's lucrative, but how on earth do we get to that point where we can make sure people have housing and homes in that context?
Yeah. I mean, there's such a gap, and it's interesting too. I mean, some of the stuff that is not maybe it is a little illegal, but that you would never call them on that too. You're right. You brought up such a good point. Where there's sometimes with my telecom company that I'm like, you know what, I'm gonna pay. I have to make a phone call, so I don't pay an extra $20 a month. But I almost don't like. I hate calling so much that I might be actually willing to suck that up for a month or so. Like it's and not everyone has that, like they have to do that, but it's funny talking to your landlord how much you'll put up with. I remember so I rent in the city of Toronto, and we paid a $500 deposit that he's not allowed to ask for, but what we did know, if we didn't pay that, there's 2 other people that would take this place at the same time that would pay that, or if he said, we've heard about, pay 6 months rent in advance. Well, you can't, like, that's ridiculous. Who has, that kind of, but someone will, and then they jump you. And so when you're working like we do at Blue Door with vulnerable people who there's, we're trying to scrape together first and last of, rent they can't afford to ask for that. It puts them at such a unfair, a disadvantage, right?
Yeah, and I think your point is really good in that while I love rent subsidies and I think they're such an important tool, extra money is never going to compensate for lack of regulation of the market, right? Like if we do not regulate, all the extra money in the world isn't going to help. In fact, it can jack up prices. And so while it's a really important tool for people exiting homelessness to get into housing, in this market, it's becoming less effective because we just can't compete with other people who can do that $600 deposit or 6 months advance rent, So I think that's why it's got to be that balance of regulation, which I know is not a sexy topic for a lot of folks in the private sector. I get it. But, the impetus there is to make profit. That's the reality. But, the impetus for government is it's to protect citizens. So how do we do that best and make sure there's a balance in that?
That's right. If we're going to protect this human right to housing, there's got to be some regulation in there. And listen, I think there's still, you can still make some profit, and but there's the balance, right? It's not the extreme profits that we're seeing now. We've commodified housing so much that and there's other ways to invest your money, but right now, because of what's happened, right? It's interesting because when we so we're looking, we have to look past the private market at Blue Door to house people, and we're looking at. As many are becoming more and more acquiring housing because we can keep it affordable over the long run. We're not going to, that's the only way, because we can't depend on the private market. It's not working. You're right. When you kind of get those subsidies to pay that market rent, but that keeps going up, and so you have to get more subs. So where is the end game there where we could try and control that a bit more? It was interesting today. I had a conversation with a couple of my board members. We were talking about in Aurora, there's a 9-plex in Aurora, Ontario, and the rents are extremely affordable. But to that 15 to 1 you were talking about, the real estate agent we're chatting with, he's like, look, Michael, this is going to be bought up, and they're going to do renovictions because they see it. It needs that. They can have that excuse. You're going to hit 9. You're going to lose 9 affordable units. They're going to double the rent so they can maximize profit. Right. Yeah. And that's what happens is you're going to have to leave for a while, and then you come back and rents this much or whatever. And there's ways around it. How do we keep that? So we're not and so talking to my board, we're we're not really creating new affordable spaces if we were to look at ways to keep this. Yeah. But I said, but look at it as prevention, because we're preventing homelessness, because these are 9 people that will not find this type of rent in the, outside of this unit. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So it's, crazy times, and it just irks me. So we're talking with MPs and others. But I digress, because this is exciting stuff. You talked about your survey. So you recently launched an Ontario-wide survey around renovictions. Can you tell us a little bit about it? What kind of data are you hoping to get, and what's the end game with it?
Yeah, so please, everyone who may have experienced this or who knows someone who's experienced this, I ask that you go to reportyourrenoviction.ca. It's on the End Homelessness Ottawa website, but we really want to build a data story to match all the anecdotes that we're hearing. So I'm part of the Ontario Alliance to End Homelessness, and we're hearing from legal experts, up north, everywhere across Ontario in small rural communities, just how bad it's getting. But it's hard without the numbers to be able to really push this as a policy plank with government. And so we really want to get more of the data, but specifically on what I would call fraudulent or illegal renovictions. So yes, a renoviction is technically legal, but there's shady stuff happening. And that shady stuff is those sort of intimidation tactics where you never even get to an official notice. But, these things are being used by landlords and people are getting intimidated. And again, I don't want to demonize anybody here. I think we're in a market where if I'm maybe somebody who's closer to retirement, or this has been a retirement project, let's say I have a building, it's old, it does need maintenance. What's my choice? In this market, my choice is going to be to sell, because it's going to be a lot more lucrative for me and to have legacy tenants who pay low rents move out. And I think unless we tackle that side of it, it's going to be really challenging. So the survey is to get that data. We wanted to make it Ontario-wide, not just Ottawa specific, and really start to build that data story. And part of what we're doing is partnering with the Right to Housing, the national network, with the hopes of starting to bring forward some of these stories with the data to the federal housing advocate and start to say, hey, here's some numbers for you. Here's some data. These are rights bearers. How do we start to have some of these become cases? I know there's a desire to bring more of those cases forward and really put renovictions on the map as a core issue to solving the housing crisis. So that's the goal. And I'm asking everyone who knows anyone who may have had this happen. You know, it's happened to my own family and friends. Like, this thing is real. Please fill out the survey, because we're really trying to have an Ontario-wide picture. And anybody in another province who wants to do it, I mean, we based it on the legal process that you would follow in Ontario, but feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to share what we have in terms of the structure and all of that. So.
Fantastic. As we know, in this sector, data is power, because the first question you always get asked if you're looking for funding or action is, well, how big of a problem is it? What are we looking at here? And this is exactly what you could do. If we want this to take, if we want people to take action, we've got to show them this is a big deal. This is hurting a lot of people. And to that end, anyone who's listening, put that out there. Where can they go actually to take the survey, share the survey?
Yeah, so if they go to either the End Homelessness Ottawa website, it should be on the main page, front page there, but also reportyourrenovictions.ca should take them straight there. So that's the link, and I will get the link to you guys to post as well if you could. But that's the spot we'd ask people to go and send it to everyone you know that you think. We've been trying to post especially to tenants groups on Facebook who've organized and are fighting these renovictions. And there's other surveys kind of similar. They're not Ontario-wide, but they're more focused on trying to kind of navigate if there's a landlord that's done this consistently, to try and kind of warn other tenants from renting. So I think really good work happening there. And we're more focused on the data side to be able to bring it at that policy level to the national scene as well, knowing that Ontario is, population-wise the biggest province. So.
Yeah, I mean, and we've heard time and time again on this podcast and from experts, listen, homelessness is the result of bad policy. Getting out of it, we have to have good policy. This will help influence that. It's a step forward. I want to change gears just a little bit, because you're doing so many great things. We don't want to miss out on anything. Let's talk about another project you're working on, a citywide campaign called Starts with Home. What can you tell us?
So Starts with Home, I'm not going to lie, we kind of shamelessly stole from Vote Housing. We were like, that's a really good model. Maybe we could do. But weirdly, we had started the work about a year in advance in terms of a group of advocates on housing in Ottawa coming together and saying, could we get more strategic in advance of the October 2022 municipal election? Like, what can we do as a local, group of advocates focused on affordable housing to really drive the message home and to unify the sector in what we're trying to communicate. And then Vote Housing came along and we were like, well, that's a great model. But before that, we'd started to focus on what are the key messages? At the very least, what are the common key messages we can get to our political candidates to really get them to focus on strategic, big impact actions for the next council to implement. So that took about a year to come up. We started with 110 asks. We narrowed it down to 6. So I feel like we did a good job of editing. It was a lot of work, but a lot of collaboration and expertise that came into that. And so we got to a point where we developed kind of 3 core pillars. One is exactly what we're talking about, stop the loss. How do we stop the loss of affordable housing? And one of them is about tenant protections and increasing that. And the other action is about having a nonprofit acquisition strategy. So when a big building is up for sale and it's aging rental stock, we know the story. The story is that probably it's going to get sold, it's going to get demolished or renovated, and higher paying tenants are going to come in. So how do we make sure that the city actually has a preemptive right to first look at a building and purchase before it goes to the private market? And if the municipality can do that and then turn it over to nonprofit housing. So that's a really big piece. It's happening in Montreal. They've just started this, but that's all under just stopping the loss of affordable housing. The next one, not a shocking concept, create more affordable housing. That's sort of our big pillar. And some of that's with inclusionary zoning, but the key piece of that being income-based, not market rent-based, but that it's 30% of a household's income, whatever that income is. And knowing that there's a balance there too. But then the other piece of that is just wanting to see our city double the amount that they've committed to in the 10-year plan from 500 to 1,000 households housed per year. So that requires obviously more investment, more building. But those are kind of the 2 planks under that. And then our third pillar is preserving the quality. And of that, there's landlord licensing as one piece, but one that I'm most excited about is really following the federal model of having a housing advocate at the local level. So we've called it a housing ombudsperson, but really baked into the municipality across kind of all programs. And what would it look like if the planning department had to assess with the lens of housing as a human right whenever they're approving projects? Is this going to displace people? Because if it's going to displace people, that has real ramifications. And if we've committed to having housing as a human right be baked into our policies, we wouldn't have a Heron Gate. And that is a stain on Ottawa. I think it was the largest mass eviction, certainly in Canada, if not in North America. 500 individuals, 300 families. And it was cheap rental housing. And they basically, Timber Creek, now Hazelview, basically those tenants have all been displaced and they built luxury condos there. They're sort of offering some new affordable, but it's tied to market rent, completely detached from people's incomes. And that should not happen. Like, that should not happen. Ottawa's like the richest city in Canada. I think the highest median income. You know, it's unacceptable that this is happening in our communities. So we really want to focus on making housing as a human right be baked into how we do the work, no matter where we are. So yeah, that's the hope. And our goal is to get 20,000 endorsers who are voters in Ottawa. So I'd ask everyone, if you're from Ottawa and you're listening, go to startswithhome.ca, endorse the campaign. We need to show that political muscle to the candidates running for election, commit to these things and build on it. This is just the base, in my opinion. So please, please, please support us if you're from Ottawa. And we want to be able to show that message to candidates that this city cares deeply about affordable housing. We launched with about 100 organizations as well. And we had everyone from community organizations working with folks who are homeless to the Board of Trade and tourism, Ottawa tourism, because they all see the connection to affordable housing. I can't hire anybody who can afford to live in my city. That was what the Board of Trade told us. And so they see how important this is to be able to have housing as the base in our community.
Very exciting. And I know you have some good people on council there too, that hopefully are able to stay in and keep pushing this forward and will drive this, that have made some good waves. So that's incredible. That's good. And you know, all the steps you were talking about, very, very exciting. You mentioned quite a few different things. If someone wants to connect with you, Kaite, or is interested in learning more about the work at End Homeless Ottawa, where can they go? What are some options?
So our website is www.endhomelessnessottawa.ca. Again, super long, I realize that. And then our emails, my email is kaite@endhomelessnessottawa.ca. So people are free to reach out to us. The contact information's on our website as well. But happy to connect with folks across the country who are doing this great work. And I've learned so much from the colleagues around the country who are invested in this and have taught me so much about this.
It's interesting you said before, hey, we took this idea, we would listen. I think every good idea has come from something like that, and I think we that's the beautiful thing about our sector is, hey, it's worked well here. Why not take that? Yeah. Our construct program at Blue Door was because of Choices for Youth and building up in Toronto and Purpose Build in Manitoba. Much of what we do is modeled after someone else, right? So that's what we should be doing. If it works somewhere else, why would you not take that and run with it? So you're doing important, 100%. Awesome work. We need some engagement, not only from the Ottawa community. We heard today too that, you know, across Canada on the renovictions piece, if you want to reach out and find out more, but specifically in Ontario, go and you know, share your stories, share your information. So we build up this database. We can make policy change. We can make great change happen so we can prevent and end homelessness. Kaite, thank you so much for all you and your team are doing. I know it's not a huge team. How big is the team?
I like to call us small but mighty. There's 3 of us. There used to just be 1 of us, but we've been fortunate to grow a little bit in the last year or so. Well,
that's what we call a tripod. And if one of those legs comes out, you know what happens to a tripod? The whole thing falls down. 3 people working hard. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks for all you're doing.
Thanks so much, Michael. Take care.
Awesome. Well, I really, really enjoyed today's show. I mean, I always do. But you can see I was getting a little excited. It's not just the coffee, the 4 or 5 cups of coffee that I had this morning. This is important stuff. I mean, we're fighting to add more units. And at the same time, we've got the leaky bucket piece that Katie was talking about is we've got to stop new people from coming in. We have to stop losing units that are already there, right? We have to redefine a bunch of things. We have to make processes easier and change systems. We got a lot of work to do, but we have good people like Katie and her team making that happen. Another awesome guest on the way home. Keep listening, share it widely. This is brought to you by the good folks at Blue Door and the Canadian Alliance End Homelessness, and we will see you next week on the way home.